The year 1939 began with a silence that felt heavy, a cold dread that stretched across the European continent. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the rise of the Third Reich and the fall of Poland, a different kind of storm was brewing in the frozen north. Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted leader of the Soviet Union, looked at the map of Finland not as a sovereign nation, but as a strategic chess piece that needed to be moved. The Soviet Union was a titan, a sprawling empire of steel, millions of soldiers, and an industrial machine that seemed unstoppable. Finland, by contrast, was a nation of farmers, foresters, and hunters. To the Kremlin, the conquest of Finland wasn't a question of if, but a matter of a few weeks. They expected a parade, a swift demonstration of Bolshevik might that would secure the borders of Leningrad and humiliate the Nordic resistance. On November 30th, 1939, the silence was broken. Without a formal declaration of war, the Red Army launched a massive offensive. Nearly 500,000 Soviet soldiers poured across the Finnish border, supported by nearly 4,000 tanks and an armada of aircraft that darkened the sky. The odds were beyond impossible. The Soviet Union had a population of 170 million. Finland had less than 4 million. The Red Army had more tanks than the Finnish army had anti-tank rifles. It was David versus Goliath, but in a landscape that God himself seemed to have abandoned to the ice. As the Soviet columns marched into the Finnish interior, they entered a world they were fundamentally unprepared for. The forests of Karelia were ancient, dense, and suffocating. The roads were narrow, winding paths that trapped the heavy Soviet tanks and trucks. And then the temperature began to plummet. It was one of the coldest winters in recorded history. The mercury dropped to -30, then -40, and eventually -50 degrees Celsius. In this environment, human life becomes a fragile thing. Metal becomes so cold it tears the skin off your hands. Oil in the engines of the Soviet T-26 tanks turned into a thick, useless sludge. Bread froze so hard it had to be cut with saws. And it was here, in this white hell, that the legend of the White Death was born. His name was Simo Häyhä. Standing barely 5 feet tall, he was a man of few words and immense discipline. Before the war, he was a simple farmer and a champion marksman in the Finnish Civil Guard. He didn't look like a legendary warrior. He didn't have the build of a commando, but Simo possessed a set of skills that made him the most lethal predator the world had ever seen. He didn't just understand the snow, he was part of it. When Simo was called to the Kola riverfront, he didn't ask for specialized equipment. He arrived with his Finnish-made M28-30 rifle, a variant of the Mosin Nagant. While modern snipers are defined by their high-tech optics and telescopic sights, Simo made a choice that defied military logic. He refused to use a scope. He relied entirely on iron sights. To Simo, a scope was a liability. He knew that in the sub-zero temperatures, the glass of a scope could fog up or frost over, rendering it useless at the critical moment. He also knew that the sun's reflection off the lens would act like a beacon, a flash of light that would tell every Soviet counter-sniper exactly where he was hiding. But perhaps most importantly, using iron sights allowed him to keep his head lower to the ground. A scope forces a sniper to raise his head a few inches higher to align his eye with the lens. In a world where an inch of exposed forehead is a death sentence, Simo chose to be invisible. His preparation was an art form of survival. Simo would leave his camp in the pre-dawn darkness, trudging through waist-deep snow to reach a position he had scouted the day before. He would find a depression behind a fallen tree or a dense thicket of pine. Then he would begin the ritual. He would pack the snow in front of his rifle barrel until it was as hard as stone. He did this so that when he fired, the sudden blast of gases from the muzzle wouldn't kick up a cloud of loose snow and reveal his position. He would also pour water over the snow in front of him, letting it freeze into a solid crust of ice to further stabilize his shot. But it was his personal camouflage that truly turned him into a ghost. He wore a heavy, all-white suit over his uniform. He looked like nothing more than a mound of snow. To hide the steam from his breath, which in -40 degrees looks like a plume of white smoke, Simo would keep a mouthful of snow at all times while he was aiming. This cooled his breath, allowing him to remain perfectly hidden even as he exhaled. He would lie in the same position for hours, motionless, his heart rate slowed by years of hunting in the Finnish wilderness. He wasn't just waiting for a target, he was waiting for the perfect moment. The Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were a nightmare of tactical errors. They wore dark green uniforms that stood out like ink on a white page. They were terrified of the woods, huddled together for warmth around campfires that served as targets for Finnish mortars. They were forced to stay on the roads, creating what the Finns called madi, encircled pockets of troops that were slowly starved and picked apart. The Soviet conscripts began to notice a terrifying pattern. A soldier would be reaching for a cigarette or adjusting his helmet, and his life would simply end. There was no sound of a gunshot. The extreme cold and the way sound traveled through the dense, snow-heavy trees meant that by the time the sound of the rifle reached the Soviet ears, the bullet had already done its work. The psychological toll was devastating. Soviet commanders began to realize that their men were being hunted by something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't kill. They gave him a name, Belaya Smrt, the White Death. The rumor spread through the Soviet trenches like a virus. They spoke of a demon that lived in the trees, a spirit of the winter that was punishing them for invading his land. Simo's effectiveness was staggering. In the first few weeks of the war, he was credited with 10 kills a day, then 15, then 20. In one extraordinary 3-day period, he was credited with over 50 kills. This wasn't just luck. It was a mastery of ballistics and human psychology. Simo didn't just aim for the head. He understood the lead required for a moving target, the drop of the bullet over distance, and the way the wind moved through the valleys of the Kolaya. The Soviet high command grew desperate. They couldn't allow a single sniper to demoralize an entire division. They began to send their own elite snipers, men trained in the best schools of Moscow, to find and eliminate the White Death. These were duel scenarios, the kind of legendary encounters that history books are built on. But one by one, the Soviet snipers failed to return. Simo would wait them out. He had the patience of the forest itself. He would watch a Soviet sniper's position for an entire day, waiting for the slightest movement, the twitch of a finger, the glint of a lens, or the steam of a breath. When the moment came, Simo was faster. He didn't miss. When snipers failed, the Red Army turned to artillery. They would identify a general area where they believed the ghost was hiding, and they would rain high-explosive shells onto the forest. They leveled trees, shattered rocks, and turned the white snow into a blackened, cratered mess. But when the smoke cleared and the Soviet infantry moved forward, the ghost was gone. Simo had a sixth sense for danger. He would move his position long before the first shell landed, sliding through the shadows like a wolf. By midwinter, Simo Häyhä's kill count had surpassed 200. He had become a national hero in Finland, a symbol of the sisu, the unique Finnish blend of stoic determination, grit, and bravery. The Finnish newspapers began to report his tallies, and his fame reached the international press. To the world, he was a miracle. To the Soviets, he was a curse. They began to use their air force to try and spot him from above. But in the dense canopy of the Karelian pines, he was invisible. The war was now a stalemate of blood and ice. The Red Army was suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties, mostly from frostbite and the constant grinding attrition of the Finnish guerrilla tactics. The Mahdi battles were becoming graveyards of Soviet armor. And through it all, Simo continued his work. He wasn't just using his rifle, he was also an expert with the Suomi KP/-31 submachine gun. In close quarters combat, when Soviet squads tried to flush him out, he would switch from his bolt-action rifle to the rapid-fire submachine gun, eliminating entire squads before they could even raise their weapons. His total kill count was rising toward 500. It was a number that defied comprehension. No sniper in history had ever achieved such a total in such a short amount of time. And he did it all in less than 100 days of combat. He was a man who lived on the edge of death every single second. Yet he remained remarkably calm. In his diaries, he didn't write about the glory or the numbers. He wrote about the weather, the quality of his equipment, and the loss of his friends. He saw himself not as a reaper, but as a protector. He was the wall that stood between his family's farm and the red tide that threatened to swallow it. As the winter of 1940 deepened, The conflict at the Kola River became a symbol of the entire war. The phrase Kola holds became a mantra for the Finnish people. But for Simo Häyhä, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. The Soviet command was no longer just embarrassed. They were obsessed. They had realized that the White Death was not a myth, but a single mortal man. And if he could be killed, the spirit of the Finnish resistance might finally break. They shifted their strategy from standard warfare to a dedicated hunt. Every time a shot rang out from the tree line, the Soviets would respond with a localized scorched earth policy, saturating the area with mortar fire and specialized hunting squads. Simo, however, remained a student of the terrain. He began to vary his routine even more. He would sleep in different locations every night, often in holes dug deep into the snow to mask his body heat. He began to study the Soviet movements not just as targets, but as a language. He could tell by the way a soldier walked if he was a fresh conscript or a seasoned veteran. He targeted the officers, the radio operators, and the scouts. By removing the brain of the Soviet units, he left the body paralyzed in the cold. It was a surgical approach to war, one that relied on the realization that a single well-placed bullet could be more effective than 1,000 artillery shells. But the toll on Simo's body was immense. Lack of sleep, constant exposure to sub-zero temperatures, and the psychological weight of being the world's most hunted man began to wear on him. Yet his discipline never wavered. He continued to pack the snow in front of his rifle. He continued to keep the snow in his mouth. He continued to use iron sights, even as the winter light became dim and gray. His kills surpassed 400, then 450. The numbers were so high that even the Finnish High Command began to double-check the reports. But the witnesses, the soldiers who served alongside him, confirmed the impossible. Simo was not just a sniper. He was a phenomenon of ballistics. The turning point came on March 6, 1940. The snow was heavy that day, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and frozen pine. The Soviet forces launched a massive push to finally break the Kola line. In the chaos of the battle, Simo found himself in a close-quarters engagement that moved faster than he could anticipate. As he pivoted to engage a target, a Soviet soldier spotted the movement. This wasn't a duel at a distance. It was a frantic exchange in the middle of a forest massacre. The Soviet soldier fired an explosive bullet, a projectile banned by international conventions, but common in the desperation of the Winter War. The bullet struck Simo in the lower left jaw. Upon impact, the explosive charge detonated. It was a wound that should have been instantly fatal. The left side of his face was shattered. His jawbone was splintered, and his cheek was virtually gone. Simo fell into the snow, his blood turning the white powder a deep, dark crimson. His fellow soldiers, seeing him fall, rushed to his side. They described the scene as horrific. One soldier later said that half of his head was simply missing. They carried him back through the woods on a makeshift stretcher, certain that they were carrying a corpse. But the sisu that had defined Simo's life didn't desert him. Despite the catastrophic damage to his skull and the massive loss of blood, his heart kept beating. He was transported to a field hospital and then to a military hospital in the interior. He fell into a deep coma. For a week, while the doctors fought to reconstruct what was left of his face, Simo hovered between the world of the living and the dead. The Finnish newspapers, fearing the worst, began to prepare his obituary. The nation held its breath. The ghost of the Winter War had finally been silenced. Then, on March 13, 1940, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. By a stroke of cosmic irony, it was the very same day that the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, ending the Winter War. Finland had survived, but at a heavy price. They had lost territory, but they had kept their sovereignty. Simo woke up to a world that was suddenly at peace, but he was a man transformed. His face was permanently disfigured, a mask of scars that would serve as a lifelong reminder of the Kola River. The aftermath of the war was a strange time for Simo. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, the largest rank jump in the history of the Finnish military. He was awarded medals and hailed as a savior. But the man who returned to the farm was the same quiet hunter who had left it. He underwent 26 surgeries to reconstruct his jaw. He had to learn how to speak again, how to eat again. He never complained. When people asked him if he felt guilt for the hundreds of lives he had taken, he would look at them with his one remaining clear eye and say simply, "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could." Simo lived for another 62 years after the war. He became a successful moose hunter and a dog breeder. He lived a life of profound modesty, avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. He never married. He lived alone in a small house near the Russian border, the very border he had defended with such lethal precision. He watched as the Soviet Union, the titan he had fought, grew into a superpower and then eventually collapsed. He remained a living relic of a time when the world was on fire. In his final years, Simo was moved to a veterans nursing home in Hamina. Even then, in his 90s, his mind remained sharp. He would sit by the window, looking out at the Finnish forests, perhaps seeing the ghosts of the Kola River in the dancing shadows of the pines. When he passed away in 2002 at the age of 96, he was buried under a simple headstone. It didn't list his kill count. It didn't mention the White Death. It simply had his name, his dates, and the word, home. The legacy of Simo Häyhä transcends military history. He is a reminder of the power of the individual against the machine. In an age of industrial slaughter, where millions were killed by buttons pressed miles away, Simo was a throwback to a different kind of warrior. He was a man who took full responsibility for every shot. He didn't hate the men he killed. He respected them as enemies, but he valued his home more than their lives. To this day, military academies around the world study Simo's tactics. They analyze his use of iron sights, his camouflage techniques, and his psychological endurance. But they can never truly replicate the man. They can teach the physics of a bullet, but they cannot teach sisu. They cannot teach the quiet, iron-willed resolve of a farmer who decides that his land is not for sale and his freedom is not for negotiation. As the wind howls through the Karelian forest today, the story of the White Death remains a chilling whisper. It is a story of a ghost in the snow, a man who became a legend by becoming nothing at all. He was the silence before the shot. He was the cold that never left. He was Simo Häyhä, the farmer who stood against an empire and won. And in the annals of war, his name will forever be synonymous with the terrifying, invisible power of the man who waits.